Thank you. Okay, so as Norman and Emma did, just a bit of background history because it's always good to get the context. I actually did have a life before microboards, and in that life, I started working, bringing people out of institutions in 1982. That's when I was about 3. And worked as a behavior consultant, which at that time, I think back on it and go, yeah, it was just, we didn't really even know what they were. So you just got that label if you're willing to work with people that were struggling. So I was a behavior consultant, considered an expert, which was always scary. And knew all the stuff you're supposed to know about reinforcements, intermittent reinforcements, Pavlovian response, etc. But I never got it. Like, I never understood that stuff. I wasn't really good at that. Because I think, when I think back on it, that a lot of my training was in sociology. That's what my degree was in. And we look at systems of people and culture. And so when you look at a lot of the training that was done for people, it was psychology, and it's trying to fix the brain of people. And from my perspective, I always looked at things from the perspective of community. What's this person's community? Who are the people in that community? And what do they mean in the context of that person's life? So I think it gave me the opportunity to think very differently than most people during that time around how to support people. And I think probably one of the important things for me to acknowledge is back then, my greatest teacher was a woman named Berna, who actually is no longer with us. But at that time, Berna was pretty notorious in our large institution, which was called Woodlands. And I was charged with bringing Berna back to community. And the first thing I did that people took issue with was I moved in with her. So I thought, if I'm introducing her to community, I'm not going to stick her in a house and then make sure there's shifts of people around her to make it make sense. I'm going to live with her. And that caused a lot of anxiety for the organization I worked for. A lot of people were making mention of the fact that she was dangerous, that she was violent, she was unpredictable. And for me, that just made it a little bit more interesting. I thought, I think I'm going to like this woman. And I did. Instantly, we liked each other instantly, partly because from my framework, when I looked at people like that, especially people in the context of living in an institution and the culture of institution, which was compliance to survive, anybody that had the guts to be dangerous, violent, and unpredictable had a pretty strong spirit. So I wanted to know that spirit. And we had a great time, actually. I'm not going to pretend it was easy. We had lots of struggles together, lots of struggles as I learned who she was and vice versa. But she also did some amazing things that, to me, blew my mind. Like, I can remember at one point, someone had fixed dinner and they put peas in it. And I said, look, she hates peas. Like, why would you put peas in it? Well, she needs to get used to them. And I said, well, she hates them. I mean, there's all kinds of quirky food I won't eat, you know. And so they put it in front of her, and she takes a bite. She's sitting there very quietly, and then she looks at me and smiles, and then sticks her tongue out, and every pea that was in that bite came rolling out. I mean, she'd actually separated them out from the rest of the food. And the two of us cracked up. The other person felt I was very inappropriate because I was supposed to be teaching her to like peas. And I'm thinking, that's a skill I want to develop. I mean, how can you take a mouthful like that and actually pick out all the peas and then just have them roll off your tongue? It was pretty cool. So for both of us, it was a real learning experience. We developed a great relationship. We spent a lot of time together while I lived with her. And then the agency changed their policy, and I could no longer live with her. And because we'd done such a great job together, they do, which is an acknowledgement, but which happens to a lot of people, is they decided to promote me. And so I was moved out of her life. And I was cut out of her life is what actually happened. And in hindsight, I think now, I look at the way systems were, and we've come a long way. Because at that time, I had no rights. I said, but I have a friend. I want to see my friend. And they said, well, it's in her best interest that she just moves on and that you're not in her life. And I had no rights, nor did she. And when I look back on that now, it was an extremely painful time for me because I did lose a friend. And in those days, we weren't allowed to call each other friends when you were paid to be in someone's life because people moved on. And that was sound advice in most circumstances if you didn't form a relationship. But we had a relationship, and I know what my level of grieving was, and I can only imagine what hers would be, given she came from a very isolated environment. And it pained me because years later, I was in a workshop where one of the latest behavior modification programs was being introduced, and it had gotten a big brouhaha in Vancouver, and they'd worked with 6 subjects, and one of them happened to be Berna. And this was probably 15 years after I'd lived with her. And they were showing stuff like they accomplished great things with her and all these things she was doing that she'd never done before. And every single thing they demonstrated she'd done before, and I'd been there when she'd done it. She was dancing in the thing, but there was no joy in it. They just had her dancing because they'd repeated and repeated and repeated. And so she danced. And it broke my heart, and I can only imagine what it was like for her. because I kept thinking, if I'm feeling this way, what is it like for her to be the trained monkey up there dancing? That's horrible. I don't ever want to see that happen again. And I felt I'd failed her as a friend. And so this is not a positive story, but for me it was a catalyst in my commitment to ensuring that people that have behaviors as a way of expressing what's going on for them are respected and that they're understood and they have relationship. And that was a pivotal moment in my life, because I promised myself and those that I supported I would never fall back on the traditional programs that are used, and that my experience was relationship is everything. And so it really led me down a very different path. So what I learned from Berna was the power of caring and trust transforms lives. It absolutely transformed mine, and I know it transformed hers. And true friendship is powerful, and it should not be toyed with. I think it's really important as we're looking at our children, and I am a parent of children with special needs, that we really honor the relationships in those children's lives, and that we support them and that we encourage them. And behavioral issues are often a sign of courage and determined spirit. Oftentimes we see it as problematic. I actually view a lot of behavioral issues as this is somebody who's saying, you're not with me, you're not. And I think that's a positive thing. And how do we help that person find another way to be able to say that? How do we honor their power and help them use other ways to describe what they need and they want? And to look for a better way to listen to people that use behavior to communicate. So often, as Norman and I talked about and other people have talked about, we see the behavior and the person as the problem, and it's their behavior, instead of just going, well, this is going on, and that's unusual. I wonder why that's happening. And I think it's really important that we respect that this is a person's communication, and maybe we're not listening correctly to that communication. And I say all this stuff as a mom who has a child with challenging behaviors, and I'm not always doing that, believe me. There's lots of times where I will lose it and just say, just stop doing that. And then I'll realize, okay, was that very productive? And my experience is every time I've ever done that, it's not particularly productive, but I'm human. And I think that for parents, we have to remember that as well. And so Berna sent me on a journey that led me to microboards, which people have mentioned here, and there's a fantastic organization that supports the development of them. And I'm just going to briefly, in case there's people in the room that don't know what a microboard is, because given there's also a lot of technology in the room, people may assume it has something to do with technology. So what is a microboard? Quite simply, it's a small group of trusted family and friends that join with a person to create a not-for-profit society. They make a commitment to having a relationship with that person, to being trusted with them and by them in their lives. And that's their first and foremost function, is to have a relationship with the individual. And they're dedicated in supporting that person to make sure their life is the way they want it to look, and that their wishes and dreams are being honored. They're committed to ensuring the person has a self-determined life. So their response is to figure out what that person's telling them and then help to make those things happen in the person's life. And a microboard advocates to create a customized service for the individual that demonstrates his or her wishes. So they work together to try to figure out what does this person want life to look like, and how are we going to help them create that reality. So that's just a very quick picture of a microboard, and I'm sure if you want more information, there's many people in the room that can help you with that are doing quite inspiring work here. This is Bree, who's at the center of this one, with her mom and dad, her brother, and her sister-in-law. And what I thought I'd do with the rest of my time is just tell a few stories, and Bree is the first one. And so Bree is a young woman that obviously you can see she's in a chair, and she has CP, and she doesn't have any what I would call traditional language. She doesn't speak. What she can do is she's got very expressive eyes, and she can move her head, it's in her control, and she can make some sounds. And her family, since she was wee, made a commitment to understanding that with her, that was her way of communicating. They wanted to honor it and respect it, and that's what they do, is they honor and respect her communication. She also has a system she used through eye gaze to support people, or to talk to other people. But the family is also teaching people, she can't always have her computer with her, the other ways that she tells you stuff. And she's pretty clear. Like I've heard Bree say no, and I don't think too many people would misunderstand what she was saying when she's saying no. But for her family, it was exhausting at times, because Bree would get quite angry at different points in her life, and it was actually healthy, because Bree's brother's 2 years older than her. She has lots of cousins who are about her age, and what she'd see happening is things that were going on in their lives that are pretty typical as somebody grows and becomes a teenager and then a young adult, and those things weren't happening for her. And so she would protest, but the difference is they'd listen, and they weren't seeing her behaviors as problematic. They recognized something's going on. What is it she wants? They didn't assume it was everything that was going on in her brother's life or everything that was going on in her cousin's life because they weren't doing the same things. But she obviously wanted to have a life that looked more typical to her peers. And so her family went really hard to make sure that was a reality for Bree. And this is Bree with her microboard. The people on the microboard, it's multi-generational. Her grandmother's there, there's 2 aunts, her parents obviously, and several cousins. And what they do, and also a former neighbor. And this isn't her whole microboard. She has a huge microboard, which is not typical. And they're pretty rowdy, and her mom, Terry, who actually works for us, is quite a character. What she says she does is she gets everybody together when they're going to talk, and she feeds them, and then that way it gives Bree an opportunity to tell them what she wants because they all shut up while they eat. So they're listening while they're eating. So they've got a whole strategy worked out for communicating stuff. But what's really nice about the multi-generational factor there, too, is that the parents and grandparents have one particular perspective, and the cousins and the young neighbor have a very different one. So when they would say, we've noticed Bree's having a problem right now. Every time this happens, she seems to be upset. And the younger people there can often say, well, yeah, the one situation was about when she was going to bed because they were trying to figure that out, and she had medications and blah, blah, blah. And one of her cousins just piped up and said, well, I'm not going to bed at 10 anymore. And she says, well, what do you do? She says, well, I go to bed at different times. So then what they had to do is go back to the doctor and have a conversation about her medications and how can we make it more flexible, because Bree sometimes wants to stay up and watch movies, or she wants to visit friends. So that kind of stuff was worked out with the help of her microboard, and having that multi-generational lens really helped them really look at different ways of doing things. One of the things Bree made really clear was that she's a very social person, and she wanted to be in community and do something that she felt was helpful to her community. So I don't know if this happens in Australia, but at Christmas time we have the Red Kettle Drive, and it's the Salvation Army, and they have these red kettles, and they sit in malls, and they collect money. They shake bells, which Bree quite likes, and they collect money for the community for a Christmas benefit. And Bree indicated that's what she wanted to do, and her mother was like, oh, are you kidding me? You want to sit in a mall for hours and collect money? But what her mom underestimated is the number of people that Bree knew in her community, and this was they live in a northern community, I have to say this first of all, and in winter in northern British Columbia, nobody wants to leave their house. So the social environment is usually malls and rec centers. That's where everybody spends their time. So Bree would sit there for 4 hours a day, about 3 times a week, and she'd catch up with tons of friends because everybody was coming through the mall. And so for her, it met a bunch of needs, social needs, which her mom hadn't anticipated. And so she just trusted that Bree knew what she was talking about, and they just made sure they could provide the support so that Bree could do that. The other thing that Bree started making really clear to everyone, and they started listening, and again, it's not always easy, is that she wanted to take more risks, that her brother and her cousins were doing things like water skiing and snow skiing and doing things that she wanted to try some of that stuff. And her cousins were going, well, yeah, I don't see why she can't. And her mom was going, well, you recognize she's medically fragile, there's all kinds of issues, which is a mom thing to do. I do exactly the same thing. And her brother and one of her cousins said, well, what if we figured out a way to do this where it was as safe as it could be? And her mom said, well, if you can figure that out, then we'll entertain the possibility. So long story short, they have a cabin on a lake, and it's a very active place where there's lots of speedboats and stuff like that. And there's a guy that rents out this thing, this inner tube thing, and people ride around. Normally he rents out one that's for one person or for 2 people. He never had one for 3. And what they did is they actually adapted this one so that Bree could sit in the middle, and that's her cousin and then one of her caregivers on the other side. And they took a spin, and she loved it. She was killing herself laughing. And they'd adapted it so that she had a back brace that would work for her. Well, what the guy found out was after doing that for Bree, and Bree had a great time, there was a whole bunch of other people. Like there was a grandma that wanted to use it but couldn't do it before because she didn't have the right supports. And there's a couple of other people that had individuals in their families with disabilities, and they got to use it. So all of a sudden he had this sort of specialty in his business supporting people that might not otherwise have been able to access it. So from his perspective as a businessman, it was a pretty good investment. And from Bree's perspective, it was a riot. So she every summer looks forward to going and using that inner tube now when she goes to the lake. This is Marcel, and Marcel and I have known each other for 30 years. I first met Marcel when I was a behavior consultant, and I was brought up to his community because he was an extremely difficult person, and they figured I was going to set him right. And it was pretty interesting when I came up there, again, in a very northern community, actually, where Bree and Terry live is urban compared to where Marcel was. And so the first thing I did was met Marcel and kind of got a sense of him, and his grandma was there, so I talked to her and a couple of aunts. But his mother was living in Vancouver, which is where I'm from. And Marcel would have been about 17 at the time, and everybody felt it was best that he be in that community because that's where his roots were and people knew him. He was living in a group home, and Marcel has Prader-Willi, and I don't know if people are familiar with Prader-Willi, but it's an unsatiable desire to eat. If you can imagine having not eaten for 3 days and how hungry you would feel, he feels that way all the time, regardless. And with Prader-Willi, there can be real challenges. Obviously, when people feel that hungry, one of the big concerns for Prader-Willi is that they might eat themselves to death, quite literally. So it was a big issue for him. It was a big behavior issue, but it was also, from my perspective, a medical issue. So there's two things going on here. But again, talking and referring to what was said earlier today, is people saw Marcel as the problem. And I always find that interesting. I'm a person with MS, which is part of the reason I want this up here, because I'll bob and weave and eventually fall over, which might be entertaining for you guys, but I'm not, particularly enamored with the bruises that happen. And people accommodate me. People don't have an issue accommodating me, because if I say bluntly at times when I need to, I got MS and I need this, people go, okay, that's fine. But Marcel has a medical condition. He has Prader-Willi, and people see it as he's weak, that he just, he's just not really trying to not eat. And when I went in to meet with him and his team, the first thing I said to them when they were telling me that, and they were being very punitive with him, I said, so the first thing we're going to do is our training is nobody's going to eat for the next 3 days. Let's do that. And then let's talk about how you're all going to feel. Well, that's ridiculous. We can't not eat for 3 days. And I went, that's my point. You've got him in an environment where you're blaming him for the fact that he has an illness, a disability that he has no control over, that makes him feel like he's starving. We need to rethink this environment. And they had a real hard time with that. And it took a lot. I spent a lot of time in that community working with them. And to be honest, eventually what it resulted in is we had to get new staff because people weren't getting it. No matter what they said and how they were agreeing, they still blamed Marcel for having an eating disorder. And they also, as a result of his eating disorder, he could be a pretty challenging character. But I've also said to them, okay, so if you didn't eat for 3 days, are you going to be really cheerful? Like I think I'd be. I can say pretty much with certainty I'd be pretty darn cranky. And so when you're constantly denying him the food and you're constantly controlling his environment and giving him no freedom, I'd be pretty choked with that too. So what I did instead was sat down with Marcel and said, okay, you got this eating disorder and it's not your fault. You didn't do this on purpose, but there's some responsibility. And so let's talk about ways that we can manage that you don't feel that people are putting upon you, but you're actually recognizing, okay, I got to take some responsibility. So we gradually worked out ways to manage the food in his life. And then I said, are there other things bugging you? And the biggest one was that his mother lived in Vancouver and he lived in this small town. And he wanted to live with his mom. Well, the people in the community that ran his services were going, there's no way. He can't leave this community. And like I said, I've known Marcel for 20 or 30 years, 20 years of which he lived in this community. 10 years ago, we were finally able to spring him because a new executive came in. And every time I went back to his community, I'd always make time for Marcel and have coffee. And I said, okay, you got somebody new here. I think now's the time. Let's do it. And so we were able to convince her to release his contract and move him to Vancouver where his mother lives. And he lives in a basement suite in her house. They worked out how to manage his food, which is he recognizes he has issues. So his fridge has a compartment that's a two-door fridge that has a compartment that's locked. So the majority of his food's in that, so he can't have free access. And he knows he can't. He says, I will eat it. Then he has another portion where he's got celery and carrots and things that he can eat as much as he wants of, that he has access to freely. So he has that. And then his cupboards, it's the same thing. There's certain foods that there's a cupboard, he can just go and have it when he wants. And the other cupboards are locked until it's time for his meal. And he accepts that because we designed it together. And he was part of the decision making with that. And the other thing that was really important for Marcel is, again, in the other community, he had to exercise because a lot of people with Prader-Willi have very low tone and it's important to stay active. Well, they were doing things like they had him on a treadmill and they had him doing a variety of things that had nothing to do with the real world. He was just doing these activities. And when he got to Vancouver, I started saying, well, what do you like? What are the things you like to do? And he liked bowling, so immediately got him into a bowling league. And not a bowling league for people with disabilities. He wanted to be in a regular bowling league. And he is, and he's got a whole network of people around him as a result of that. And they understand. He's the one that explained his Prader-Willi to them, and they understand what that means. So they support him at the bowling alley so that he doesn't overeat when he's there, and the camaraderie really helps him with that. The other thing we did was he likes animals, and we got him a dog because dogs need to get walked. So now he's got a reason to walk. He doesn't have to stand on a treadmill, but he takes his dog. He loves that dog, and he walks it twice a day because the dog needs to be walked. And so he's getting exercise, but it's not for him. He's getting exercise because he loves his dog. And then the other thing that I think was really important with Marcel too was the connections with his family. And through him living in his mother's home, he was able to rebuild connections with the other members of his family. So that network has now become quite strong. And he's actually been able to go, one of his brothers got married, he had a destination wedding in Mexico. And if anybody's been there, the destination stuff in Mexico for most Canadians is like, that's your opportunity to pig out because the food's free and people go crazy. There's always a buffet somewhere. And he actually went to there, and we planned ahead of time how was he going to handle that, what were we going to do. So set up a bunch of stuff he really wanted to do in Mexico, like he swam with some seals and he did a bunch of different things there so that he could get himself away from the free food as much as possible. And he had a great time, and for his family, it was wonderful to have him participating in an important family event. And they knew that he was going to be supported by somebody that understood what was going on and was sensitive to his issues, but also ensured his maximum involvement in his community. The other thing I like about Marcel too is he has a great sense of humor. And when he first came back to the Lower Mainland, because when the community lives in, it's a ranching, I guess that would be stations here. It's a ranching community, so everybody has horses. So Marcel knew his way around a horse very well. But when he came to the Lower Mainland, to go riding is an event. It's not just part of what you do in your day. So somebody decided, well, let's go horseback riding. You mentioned you like horses. And so they didn't know like really how good Marcel was in a saddle, that he could saddle up himself, etc. So when they first got there, this is what he did. He said, okay, so how do I get on a horse? And he got on it backwards and sat there. He said, this is what I'm supposed to do? And I just loved it. That was great. Totally fun. I said, knock it off. And they're like, oh my God, he's got so much to learn. I said, not really. Turn around, Anyway, he's a great guy, and he's got the life he wants because the people in his life are listening to how he wants his life to look. And I'm not trying to paint a perfect picture. There's still lots of struggles. It's quite funny because Marcel, I think because we've known each other so long, and I know all his family, like I know a bunch of his extended family, it's just the way it's kind of worked out. He'll quite often, if he's frustrated, I'll get a call from him because I'm the answer person, and it may have nothing to do with anything. Like he may be saying, I don't want to wear my blue pants today, and I'll go, then don't wear them. It's just. But he'll call me once in a while with that kind of stuff, and he'll have trouble with some of his caregivers from time to time, the people that come in to support him that know him well, but he'll just decide that he doesn't want to listen, and so then usually I'll have to come back in and we'll have a conversation about how are we going to make this work, and at times it's not gonna, so then we work on what we need to change. So it's not ideal, but it's certainly nothing like it was looking when he was living in a small town in northern British Columbia. And as you can see, Marcel is a fairly fit guy, which is extremely rare for people with Prader-Willi. He's worked really hard at that. And I'm not saying that other people with Prader-Willi can be Marcel. I recognize what a complex illness it is. It's very complex. But in his situation, being able to set up the things the way we have, it's worked very well for him. And he has a very productive life. He's got a job. He's enjoying living with his mom's, his dog. He's got a full life. And this is Shanti, and anybody that's seen me before has heard of Shanti, and some of you even met Shanti. Shanti is the person for whom we created the very first microboard in British Columbia, and she's one of my dear friends. I met Shanti when she was 18, and like I keep saying, I was 3. And we first met, and I had no clue what I was doing. I just knew around the behavioral stuff that I sure wasn't going to be doing what other people were doing. And Shanti was another person that was considered notorious in the system. The reason we did the very first microboard with Shanti was because her mother had called one of our sister organizations and said, my daughter's turning 19 and they're going to move her into an institution. And that's it. She's going to be institutionalized for the rest of her life. So I had a friend working in that organization who came to me and said, I think you're looking for people for this project. And I said, yeah. And she said, I think I've found your first possibility. So one of Shanti's social workers credited Shanti with her early retirement because she was such a challenge to serve. I actually saw that as a bit of a triumph because Shanti's spirit is very strong. But she had quite honestly, a horrible life when I first met her. She'd gone into care as a child. She'd broken her leg horseback riding. She has CP and she has multiple challenges. She does have a diagnosable mental illness and she has a developmental disability. And when she broke her leg, she had to go into the hospital. And of course, a broken leg for a person with a disability means you can't go into the regular hospital. You've got a disability, so you have to go into the hospital for people with disabilities because after all, your broken leg's going to look a lot different than somebody else's broken leg. So that's where she ended up. And then getting her out was really hard, and they decided she would be better off in a foster home because her mom was a single mom and she had 3 other kids, and they put her into care and had horrible things happen to her in foster care. And it broke her mother's heart. And in that day, in British Columbia, if your child went into care, you lost all custody right. That's not the way it is now. But so her mom had no say-so. And then they eventually moved Shanti into a group home, and it was extremely punitive. It was all about Shanti's problems and how to fix them, and they would use her mom as a reward. So if Shanti behaved herself, then she could talk to her mom on the phone. And for her mother to be put in that position was agonizing. She said, I don't want to be my child's behavior contingent on whether she talks to me, but she had no rights. So she pulled away because she couldn't bear the pain of that. So that was what I walked into when I first met Shanti. And she was being locked in her bedroom. She was being forced to use a walker, and she has a very difficult time with that. And it was pretty bleak when I first met her. And the first thing I did was we went out. She's turning 19, and we went out for her birthday. My husband and I took her out for her 19th birthday. And we went to a place in Vancouver that was ad hoc theater. It was a theater group that would engage the audience, and they would throw out a theme, and then they'd get you to throw out something else towards it, and they create this instant sort of comedy routine around it. And it was great. It was a lot of fun. Well, we laughed our heads off. We had a riot that night, but Shanti has some challenges with bladder control, and so when I came back, I said, I'm really sorry, but I changed, we changed and all that, but there was an accident. He goes, the guy that was working that night said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, we went to, Giggle Down when this was happening. And he went, oh, well, we don't let her laugh. And I went, pardon? He goes, well, we know she's going to be incontinent if she laughs. We don't let her laugh. I said, okay, she's 19, and you've sentenced her to a life without laughter at 19? And it was like he thought that was really logical. He said, well, yeah, we don't want, it's expensive, and we don't want to have to go through that. And I said, have you heard of Depends? It was mind-boggling. So that was the environment she was coming out of. And my first response to that was her mother had to pull away because of the pain. We need to connect her back to her mom, and that's what we did. We spent a time where my only response was to pick her up, and I'd drive her out to where her mother lived, and they'd sit and have tea, and I'd go sit at another table and just let them reconnect. And that went on for several months until her mom finally said, why don't you sit with us? That's what I did, and then I got them reminiscing about what did life look like when Shanti was a little girl, when you were all still together. And we started talking about the people that were in her life at that point, when she was young, because they came from a counterculture. Her mother is still what she called herself as a hippie, and they lived in a very small community called Lillooet, and they lived on a commune. And so I said, well, are all those people still on the commune? She said, oh, no, it shut down years ago. They're all around. And I said, well, what would get those people together? And she said, probably if we had like a summer solstice or something, and it was like we were getting people together to reminisce, and I said, well, let's do it. And that's what we did. Is the first time we connected Shanti with her people from her roots is we had a summer solstice party. And I got to tell you, we were a project working with government, and it was pretty interesting to go to our funder and say, I'm just going to organize a summer solstice party. It'll be vegan, but it's a summer solstice party. So unfortunately, we worked with an awesome man in government at the time who just went, Linda, I don't want to know the details, just tell me the results. And so we had a party, and that brought a whole bunch of people back into Shanti's life she hadn't seen in many years. And what we did was, for about a period of years, we just kept finding other reasons to socialize and bringing people back into her life. And a core group started showing up that were the ones that always came to the parties. And that's the group I approached about, let's start thinking about doing something different for Shanti. So that was the group that became her first microboard. She's had other people come on and off since, and that's the group that I consider emancipated Shanti, because they knew her, they understood her, they knew what things meant with her. When she was doing certain things, they go, oh, that's because of this, and it's, don't worry about that. That's it. Shanti, that's old news, don't worry about that. And then Shanti calmed down. And it was pretty amazing to watch that, and I learned tons from those people, because they'd known her since she was little. And a lot of stuff that she did, she'd always done, but their approach to it was completely different. There was no punishment attached to it. It was just like, oh, okay, that means this. And so over a period of time, we got that group together, and we started to create a life for Shanti and move her into her own place. And that was even an interesting process, because Vancouver is made up mostly of hilly places. We've got we've got a couple of flat communities, one being Ladner and the other one being Richmond. And when I first asked Shanti, well, where do you want to live? Because I wanted to give her the choice. She said, I want to live in New Westminster. And New Westminster is like this. And Shanti's in a wheelchair. And I'm going, okay, have you been to New West? Nope. And I said, well, I think let's go to New West and have lunch. So I took her there, and then she saw it and went, yeah, okay, maybe not. She says, are there flat places here? And I went, there's Richmond. And so we went out to Richmond and looked around, and it was flat. She said, yeah, this isn't bad. And what I said is, the other thing, there's a mall here because she likes to shop. And there was the selling point for her was there's a very large football field in Richmond. And that was close to a lot of the residential area. And there's a lot of good-looking guys playing football. And so once she saw that, she went, yeah, this is the community for me. I'm good. This is where I want to live. And so we were able to move her into a home in that community. And she lived there for quite a while. But anyway, this is Shanti and I. I promised her that if I'm going to talk about her, I have to show this picture. And this is Shanti and I. And one of the things, as I mentioned, she loves to shop, and that's something we share. Shanti and I are actually training for the women's Olympic shopping team. So this is one of our training events where we went away for the weekend to the largest mall in Canada, which is in the next province over. It's the West Edmonton Mall. It's actually quite a horrible place. It's got a Ferris wheel in it and a roller coaster, and there's these poor dolphins in the mall, and I remember thinking that's got to be animal cruelty. But anyway, what it does have is more stores than any other mall in Canada. And it has a hotel attached to it called the Fantasyland Hotel, and it's not what some people might think about fantasy. This is a hotel for women that are shopping, so that's what you got to think about with this hotel. So there's theme rooms in this hotel, and this room, which Shanti picked, is the Oscar room for movies and stuff. Well, I don't know if you can really make it out because it's quite an old picture, but there's mirrors everywhere. There's mirrors on the walls behind us, there's mirrors in front of us, and there's mirrors on the ceiling. And I got to tell you, as a woman of girth, that's not something you really enjoy. I'm laying on the bed going, oh my God, do they have any curtains for the ceiling mirrors? It's like, this is pretty daunting. And so Shanti and I, one of our caregivers, went on this trip, and we had a blast. I mean, we literally didn't leave the mall from the minute we arrived in town until we were heading back to our airplane. And it was wonderful because it was just three women having a holiday. We all loved to shop, and we were having a great time. And then in the middle of the night, I'll never forget, which was quite funny, because it was, I think, probably the last vestige of any kind of, what's the word I want to look for, looking at things through the lens of more traditional services. In the middle of the night, I could hear Shanti making this funny sound. And I'm going, oh my God, what is that? And so I turn the light on, and I look at her, and she's got what looks like blood running out of her mouth, and she's gagging. And I'm yelling at Lori, who's the person that's with us, says, Lori, I think she's having a seizure. And then she started to laugh, but what it looked like was really having a seizure because there's no sound coming out. It's like, oh my God, we've killed her. And then she finally starts talking, and it was chocolate. And we left the chocolate on the table between us, between the two beds, and she grabbed it and just taken a big bite of it in the middle of the night. So it was actually chocolate all over her face, and she wasn't having a seizure. She was laughing at me. Anyway, we had a great time on that trip. And this is another part of it that I think, for me, around relationships that's really important, is my husband's a musician, and so as a result, we have a lot of friends that are musicians. And Shanti and I were at a park by the beach one day, and my friend Ron was playing, and she really liked his music, so she bought his CD, and they embarked on a friendship that was quite independent of me. So she would follow him, like she'd go to his gigs and listen to his music, and she'd talk about, yeah, Ron was playing at the so-and-so the other night, his music was great. I said, how do you know that? She said, well, I was there. I went, you went and saw Ron? And she went, yeah. I said, without me? And she went, yeah. No, I go and see him all the time. So they developed quite a unique relationship between them based on his music that was really powerful. And that was broadening her network even more, which is, I think, a really healthy thing. And this is a group of us that get together or got together frequently. Some of our people aren't here anymore in Vancouver, but this is our annual trip to visit her mom. So with Shanti's mom, the things that were going on in her life were pretty horrific, and they both lived in the Lower Mainland. As Shanti developed relationships and people that understood her and understood her behaviors, her mom felt safe to go back to the community that she'd lived in many years ago. So she moved 8 hours out of Vancouver into a very remote community. And as I mentioned, Shanti's a shopper, and so this community has, we refer to it laughingly as the mall. It's 3 stores. And that's it. That's all there is in this community is 3 stores. So Shanti's not going to spend a lot of time there. But what we do is every summer I bundle up my kids, and then these are friends of ours that the woman works with Shanti, and they bundle up their kids, and we head up to visit her mom. And so we all either camp, well, I never camp, but the rest of them sometimes camp, and I get a cabin. And we visit. We just have a great visit. And this is the one restaurant in that community, and we usually do our farewell breakfast there. And for Shanti, it's really important because she loves her mom and wants to spend time with her, but she's also really clear she doesn't want to live there. So this is like a big event we have. And the other way we worked out her time with her mom is that we just schedule times like, yeah, mom's coming in, in August, and this is how long she's going to stay. So she knows she gets that time with her mom. But in the meantime, when her mom's not around, there's a lot of people around her, and she's active and busy in her community so that she feels she has the life she wants. Shanti's behaviors haven't gone away. They certainly are nothing like they used to be. I mean, when we first supported Shanti to move, the community she was in was quite it's quite tight-knit. It's lots of townhouses and stuff so people can hear. And there was actually a petition in the city hall to remove her from the community because she was so loud. So we've just moved. We said, well, if you don't want her, this isn't a very welcoming place. So what we did is talk to her about what was going on, and we never said, you've got to stop yelling. We just said, look, we recognize this as part of what's going on for you right now. Let's figure out a place you can live where that's not going to matter so much. So we found a little farmhouse that was next to, actually, to a truck scale, weighing scale, and it was still close to town, but it was enough out, and the trucks are always, there, so if she needed to blow off steam, it was no big deal. And it also reduced the staff's anxiety because nobody was telling them they had to make her stop yelling. And we said, what we need to do is figure out why. Why does she need to yell right now? What's going on for her? And then as we did that, it dramatically diminished the frequency with which that happened for her, because she wasn't anxious, they weren't anxious, and we were able to have dialogue about what was going on for her. She eventually moved back into a community, like into the community I live in, actually. We're very close together. Thank you. Anyway, and as a result, there still are times where she has hard times, but people don't get worked up about it. It's not she's a problem. It's like, what's the problem? Let's figure this out together. And we know a pretty good list of things that it often can be, and we'll sort of go through that to try and figure it out. So her life is much fuller and much more relaxed as a result of that. And I felt I couldn't do this without being honest about my own family. So I came in, I was this behavior person that traveled all over BC and did a lot of that. And then later in life, I became happenstance to become a mom. And these are two of my children, my two youngest, who are absolutely adorable. And people who look at them usually go, oh, aren't they cute? And they were also little hellions. And they used to, when we first got together as a family, because we were kind of an instant family, they would each, at different times, have meltdowns. And their meltdowns were intense, and they were long, and they were loud, and they were violent. And when I think about it now, I remember a point at which what I thought was going to be my breaking point was a point that made me, actually. They were both having meltdowns. And they were in their bedrooms. They were extremely loud. I'd been bitten and scratched and pinched. And I'd actually fallen on the floor and was crying. And my husband, saw what was going on. He took off. And I thought, what the heck? I'm here, having this meltdown, and you take off? What are you doing? You going for a pack of smokes and not coming back? I mean, what's going on here? Anyway, a few minutes later, he comes back, and he comes up to me like this. I've talked to all the neighbors. No one's going to call the police. I'm going, okay, I feel so much better now. But I think what it was is I realized that for all of us as parents, I mean, I have a background in behavior supports, and I don't use a lot of the tricks of the trades. It's about relationship. But as a parent, it's a different thing. And so all those things I knew and I understood, I didn't understand the context of being just a mom. And for me, it was really important for me to kind of hit that place and figure out, what do I need to do to feel supported? And I'm going to be really honest, it wasn't a lot of professionals that I went to. In fact, none. I went to my friends who had had kids that had been difficult, that I could talk to and I could unload on, and they could, do a there and say, well, this worked with my son, and my daughter used to do that, and this is how we got her out of that. That's where I got my sense of how to support my children. And they're very tight, too. I just have to say, these two little guys are still very tight. They're quite close in age. And they had their own language, which was also problematic because we never knew what they were saying to each other. Like, they'd be talking, and you could hear it was a question or a statement, and then something would happen, and we're going, what was that? And they all knew what they were talking. The two of them knew what they were talking about. So that was an interesting thing to try and learn some of their language and then bring them into a common language. It took a while, especially for our young guy. This is them today. They're at an event with me, and they're pretty amazing kids, all told. And Danica supports her brother quite a bit, and he's a pretty amazing guy that still has meltdowns now and then because he doesn't feel understood. And we know that's what it's about. So what we'll do is stop and go, okay, so what are we not hearing? And help him work it out. And I just have to say, we're also now raising our granddaughter, and she makes them look like they're going backwards. So it's a whole other element now. She's got some pretty amazing things, because she also has meltdowns, but she's also quite a debater. She's like her auntie, her older auntie. She'll argue with you about anything. And so it's like I'm going, I don't know how to do this. I thought I was done. I don't know how to do this when she has a meltdown. But again, I turn to my friends somebody's had a kid who did that, and they're helping me work it through. And when I talk about that, I mean it. These are the people, just some of the people that help me. And I couldn't do it without them. It's my network, and I need them. And I know that there's times where they've needed me. So these are people, a couple of them are people I work with, but they're all either moms or self-advocates. And my husband, who ran out to make sure the neighbors weren't going to call the police. And they've been my network that I needed, my friendships that I needed to help me understand my children. And I couldn't have done it without them. And part of what we're doing now is looking at the network that we're creating around our kids too, and they're doing a bang-up job of doing that for themselves now, I think probably because they know what it feels like to be heard. How's that? Not bad, eh? Thank you.